Activist and author Adrienne Maree Brown, on her recent return from sabbatical, wrote, "I return rested and centered, shaken by all that changed in my absence, saddened by all the loss, inspired by all the expressed rage. I feel ready to follow, document, write between the trenches, uplift and shine light on the workers, sing, comfort, and hold." Good morning. It is so good to be with you after being away for 3 months, which has felt like a very long time. It is so good to be with you this morning and in good health. Though I have been left with some residual numbness in my fingers and toes, a numbness that becomes painful at times, but it's manageable. A few weeks ago, when I was searching for some information on my calendar from the past year, the scope of all that I had experienced became obvious when I saw the many appointments listed for doctor visits, treatments, and other procedures related to my illness. But as with most life-interrupting, life-altering events, even the dreadful ones, I realized I received many gifts as a result of cancer. The gift of learning how much people care, what generous and compassionate spirits the people in my life have. So many of you accompanied me on this journey in one form or another. What a gift it has been to not travel such a daunting journey alone. And I thank you for that. I received the very great gift of space to reflect about my life and the nature of it. I also reflected on what cancer means in our culture. For most of us, myself included, it is one of the most dreaded illnesses we might receive a diagnosis for. Cancer is so dreaded that it's often used as a metaphor to refer to anything that destroys, such as it's eating away at us like a cancer. A most recent gift I received from cancer is what I've been thinking about as wound care. For each step along the way, chemotherapy, surgery, and radiation, I had to learn how to care for myself in new ways, how to tend to my wounds. I learned that it's easy to imagine healing as a passive act, but when beset by a serious illness or injury, it's easier to understand that healing is an action that requires something of us. At a most basic level, that we acknowledge our condition and tend to our wounds with persistence and determination. Even before the onset of the COVID pandemic, I was told to be concerned for my compromised immune system, that I might get an infection and become sicker. And so I had to learn how to not become sicker. What I learned about cancer and wound care from my mother and others I know who are cancer survivors or perhaps still living with cancer is to remain vigilant in caring for myself, caring for the gift that is my life. Though it is possible that I might not ever fully heal in the ways I desire. But as James Baldwin once wrote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. In this moment, we Americans, and to be sure, everyone on the planet, are in a state of woundedness. I've been reflecting about America specifically because it is the immediate context that you and I are in, wounded by a pandemic and suffering from an infection of our most ancient and insidious wound, systemic racism. Of these two wounds, I am most concerned about racism because its adverse effects make even the pandemic worse for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Racism isn't one of those wounds that you can just put in quarantine and hope that it'll heal on its own. Racism festers. Racism kills. Systemic racism entangles and infects us all, and none of us is immune from it. I had surgery on May 15th and was at home sensing I was healing well. Then on May 29th, the numbness and pain in the extremities of my fingers and toes seemed to seep into the rest of my body as I watched the televised recordings of the last 8 minutes and 46 seconds of George Floyd's life. A couple of days later, I began receiving an inordinate amount of "Are you all right?" notes, text messages, emails, and phone calls. And because I had been dealing with cancer all year and had just had surgery 2 weeks before, and because I was told my physical healing was going well, my response was, "I am doing great," because I was. And I was feeling blessed and grateful for that, even as I felt pain and numbness seeping throughout my being, which I did not speak about because it was not the first time I had experienced that particular pain, even before cancer or chemotherapy side effects in my fingers and toes. So I was struck by the quiet surprise my inquirers all seemed to have, until one day, as I was texting another minister of color who also asked how I was doing, I suddenly realized that she was not inquiring about my recent physical travails. She was asking about my existential well-being in the context of this moment in America. What I learned from cancer is that despite being an extrovert, my temperament is one that at first moves inward when I am distressed, into a realm of silence, quiet, reflection, meditation, listening to music, reading, learning, intuiting what's going on and how to make sense of it all. An inwardness that requires its own time, even if outwardly I appear to be doing many things. I was not trying to make sense of what happened to George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and others who were killed in that same time frame, whose names we do not know, because there was no sense to be made of that. I was trying to make sense of the response. People out in the streets all over the country, all over the world, protesting in the middle of a pandemic. I was admittedly horrified at the sight of all those people in all those marches, many without masks, putting their lives on the line, especially Black people who were most adversely impacted by COVID. Would it be worth it? I wrestled with outrage, pride, and cynicism. Outraged by the catalyst for all this, America's rotting, festering wound, stinking and going untreated in any fundamental way. But I was proud of the young folks out in the street leading protests, expressing their anger, starting a new conversation. In his young adult version of Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped, author Jason Reynolds prophetically acknowledged young people by saying, "All of you deserve to know that you are in fact the antidote to anti-Blackness, xenophobia, homophobia, classism, sexism, and the other cancers that you have not caused, but surely have the potential to cure." Cancer, that destroyer word again. I also felt a curious cynicism within. Bayard Rustin, the civil rights strategist who worked with Dr. King, once said, "It is the habit of most generations to see themselves in crisis and to imagine that their experience is without precedent in history." We had been here before as a nation 50, 60, 70 years ago. What would make this time different, my inner cynic wondered. Would it hold, stick, continue? I even heard that some young people didn't realize we had been here before and wanted to know how could we have left this mess for them, leaving the world like this for them. Ill-informed though they were, these were good questions. My cynicism increased as commercials that Black Lives Matter from major corporations started popping up all over the place. And people began running around to become anti-racist all of a sudden. Something about it felt uncomfortable to me and sort of suspect, like it was a trendy thing to do. Something big seemed missing. So I pause here and say that I recognize that over 10% of the white people in this congregation just completed a 30-day anti-racism challenge. And though you don't need any anti-racism cookies from me, I want you to know that I do believe this is a good thing. And many more white people in our congregation would also benefit from doing this work. What I realized was feeding my cynicism was my worry that it would all be finite. That white people especially would start feeling like they were done. They took the workshop, they were in the protest, they read the book, they did the challenge, but I'll say more about that in a moment. For now, let us all take a deep, conscious breath. Inhale. Hold it. And breathe out love.
When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love.
We all have our work, and none of us can do anyone else's. Adrienne Maree Brown. So what exactly is our work? This work of actively tending our wound, of engagement in our healing. Ibram X. Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, and his more recent, How to Be an Anti-Racist, admits that as he began writing Stamped from the Beginning, that he, an African American and historian of African Americans, held quite a few racist ideas. He points out that racist ideas are ideas. Anyone can produce or consume them. He says that as he became committed to the anti-racist idea of group equality, he was able to discover, self-critique, and shed the racist ideas that he had consumed over a lifetime. And so if you identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, this part is for you. Most of us have been dealing with systemic racism for all our lives, so we need to tend to the impact of this wound in ways that are particular for us, in spaces and among people that support our thriving and healing. I recently participated in a specifically Black, Indigenous, and people of color cohort for a management workshop, and we did a segment focused on our internalized racism. I know that that could not have happened where we would have all felt comfortable and safe outside of a cohort such as that. So do the work that makes sense for you to do in a spaces that make sense for you to do it in. We, like Kendi, must continually unpack the racist ideas that have caught hold of us without our being aware of them. Although I, like you, experience systemic racism on a continual basis, even when I'm not consciously aware of it, I am challenging myself to not be superficial about what I do know, because having a depth of understanding about the root of this experience allows me to liberate my mind and my heart, to better understand my truth and to tell it. As June Jordan says, to tell the truth is to become beautiful, and that is political, and I would add, deeply spiritual in its most profound way. We, Black, Indigenous, and people of color must also constantly and vigilantly seek ways to care for ourselves, to create joy, laughter, and community, spaces for peace and rest and the cultivation of love for its own sake. Kendi says, being an anti-racist requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. He means this for all of us. So white people, here's a true story. About 3 years ago, the civil rights activist and public theologian Ruby Sales came to Durham, and I had the privilege of spending a little time with her one-on-one. And she said to me something I didn't quite expect. She said, you all need to stop talking about white people and their privilege. There is no real privilege in benefiting from a racist society. It's destroying their souls and the souls of their children. So stop viewing white privilege as if it's a good thing, and tell them that. Because this so-called privilege is not really privilege at all. I never forgot that. As a result, I believe a primary work of white people is to understand in a specific and conscious way why dismantling systemic racism matters for you and why racism is bad for your life and cannot go ignored. Not only why it's bad for my life or my children's lives, though I certainly do want you to understand that, but you also need to know how racism impacts your humanity, the humanity of your children and grandchildren, and how your humanity is bound to my humanity, and your children's humanity is bound to my children's humanity. And once you've acknowledged this wound, get going with some wound care. For those of you who have begun this work, do not stop educating yourself and taking action to address this mess we are all in. Do not succumb to the belief that because you read some books and had some conversations, you now know the lingo and have an intellectual knowledge, but aren't motivated to do much more than read books, go to a workshop, or watch films. Do not succumb to guilt or shame, which serves no one. And resist the temptation to retreat to the comfort of your lives when things feel challenging. Because I hope you know by now that if you're really doing this work, it will feel challenging. Jason Reynolds says, becoming an anti-racist is an infinite way of being. It's an infinite conversation. It's not something we do and then we're done. The work of tending our ancient, festering wound never ends. And so though I want these things, I also recognize that you've got to want them for yourself much more than I do. Our future, the future of our children and children's children, depend on it. We are a future that someone in the past was either intentional about or unintentional about, conscious about or unconscious about. I suspect it has been a bit of both. Remember that the future is not created tomorrow. It is created today, moment by moment, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month. If we allow things to remain the same today, we and the generations after us will arrive into the future, and it too will be the same. And yet another generation will say, how could you leave this mess for us? You know, all the quotes Henry read for our opening words, with the exception of one, were written 40, 50, 60 or more years ago. Though most of us will not be around to participate, I want to know that 50 years from now, we as a people have moved on to a different conversation and are not reading quotes or writings made 50 or 100 years before because of how prophetic they were about our future. And finally, as Layla Saad writes, let us remember that this is love work. It means that you do this work because you believe in something greater than your own self-gain. It means you do this work because you believe that every human deserves dignity, freedom, and equality. It means you do this work because you desire wholeness for yourself and for the world. It means you do this work because you want to become a good ancestor. It means you do this work because love is not a verb to you, but an action. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.